Welcome to Silicon Bytes. Thank you to everyone who has supported our recent trip to Ukraine. We recorded all of the events that we were planning and, in fact, several more. So, thank you to everyone who has helped. We are almost there at the target to help pay for the editing, processing, etc. of the videos. So, to everyone who's helped so far, thank you. To anyone else who can chip in, it is greatly appreciated on Patreon or the campaign we're running on Buy Me a Coffee. Today's episode will be about the Gospel of Girkin, Strelkov Girkin, probably the initiator, the main initiator of the incredible violence that we see, the full-scale war in Ukraine. He was the one that kicked it all off. Well, more of that in a minute. Occasionally, from his prison in Russia, he apparently gets letters out, and it is these letters we'll be reviewing today. Strelkov is back with more pronouncements. It has been many months since the untimely reports of his demise spread around the Z-blogosphere. And of course, we are not concerned about his health or even his welfare. He is a war criminal and bears even more responsibility for this horrific war than most Russians do. His views on the state of the Russian army, however, may hold some interest, and he has been known to occasionally give critical assessments of the competence and performance of the Russian army, some of which has been far closer to reality than the manipulative discourse of Russian propagandists and Z-patriots. This episode is adapted from a report that appeared on Michael Naki's YouTube channel in Russian, and I will put a video link in the description of the video in case you are interested in checking that out. Girkin Strelkov is in prison, yes, but it's the wrong prison. And he's not incarcerated for his crimes against Ukraine and against humanity, but of his disloyalty to the regime that approves of those war crimes. He was an FSB officer who went to Donbass with a gang of thugs, supported by resources from oligarch Konstantin Malafiev, and started provocations and murders there. He blazed a trail for the Russian army to intervene and for today's full-scale invasion. But during the full-scale war, Strelkov's assessment of the actions of the Russian army were nearly uniformly negative. These statements are not because he disapproves of the invasion, but because he fears it is neither being conducted efficiently nor ruthlessly enough. But in the long term, I emphasize, if we continue to fight, or rather continue to operate as we are now, we will not hold anything. Even the Kremlin will not hold over time, says Girkin. So his prison sentence is for discrediting the Russian army and challenging the authority of the killer in the Kremlin. There is a certain irony in Girkin Strelkov falling foul of the regime he fought for. But this kind of irony is familiar from Russian history and reflects the punitive structure of Putin's Russia. So why even bother covering his pronouncements? Well, because his assessments have often reflected real problems that exist in the Russian army. Some of his forecasts for that army correspond to how change later played out. Some other Z-bloggers occasionally make critical statements and sometimes point towards the reality on the ground, but these are rare and exceptional moments. In general, they repeat the Defense Ministry's manuals and propagandistic scripts as a form of entertainment. In this respect, Girkin is closer to Prigozhin in that his screeches of protest and weaponized whining are most often directed towards the Russian army, not the Ukrainians, and its callous, incompetent leaders. Strelkov believes the situation has got worse. What's more, Russia may face not just defeat, but a form of collapse. This is possible because of how the Russian army fights, how the Russian elite behaves, and the decisions of Vladimir Putin, he says. Well, this video today summarizes several letters recently penned by Strelkov and apparently smuggled out of his prison cell. Much of what he said previously was negative, but his prediction for the collapse of Russian military power in Syria has come to pass. He's also talked about Russia's adventures in Africa, also possibly having a sell-by date. The Russian army has actually, of course, been ejected from Syria. So, what does he say about the current topics of discussion, such as the so-called ceasefire? It will not be a respite for Russia, he says. The enemy will not observe the ceasefire at all. There will be no respite for our army. They will shoot at us, they will build fortifications before our eyes, concentrate troops, and then NATO troops will be brought in. He puts all this in language that will be familiar for those who have heard Putin's whining and repetition of illusory grievances and perceived slights by the West. Moscow will respond with dismal protests, he says, and then someone will again say, with an offended voice, how he was led by the nose. We were simply deceived again. They tricked us. They swindled us. They rudely tricked us. All this is very familiar from Putin's speeches. Girkin continues, this year so much will probably change that all current realities will seem wild and a mirage or a legend of ancient times, he said. Clinging to the ghost of a happy past is typical of aging and decrepit declining states and civilizations. We are in for a very cruel sobering up after a quarter of a century of thoughtlessly living the legacy of our ancestors. Soon people will probably have to fight en masse and work hard, not for ideas, but simply for a piece of bread and a little heat and electricity during the long winter, Strelkov predicts. This is his long-term prediction, and one wonders whether he's been watching my videos with Konstantin Samalov because the words sound remarkably familiar. But what are his predictions for 2025? He writes the situation for the Russian Federation is of a largely negative character. By the end of the third year of war, none of the tasks that were enshrined as goals have been accomplished or are close to being accomplished. Zelensky's regime has not been overthrown, but is holding on tighter than it was in 2022. Under the conditions of war, the de-Russification of Ukraine continued at an accelerated pace, not even the so-called denazification of Ukraine. But Girkin has not let go of the false tropes of Putin's regime, however. He says Nazi propaganda is brainwashing the population of Ukraine. Hatred towards Russia has not decreased, but has increased many times over. Well, why would this surprise him at all? When Russia invaded Ukraine to destroy its cities, torture its people, kill its soldiers, and kidnap its children. Ukraine did not become more disposed towards Russia because Russia destroyed many Ukrainian cities and a large number of Ukrainian citizens. Secondly, Strelkov writes, no demilitarization of Ukraine has been achieved. On the contrary, it now has an experienced army of several 100,000, armed perhaps better than before the start of the full-scale invasion, better organized, better trained, experienced, and far more persistent. Despite fatigue and losses from war, there are no signs of imminent disintegration of the Ukrainian armed forces. Ukraine is conducting military operations on the territory of the Russian Federation, occupying parts of the Kursk region. Russian troops, combined with North Koreans, have not been able to dislodge the enemy for almost 6 whole months. The armed forces of Ukraine are increasing their capabilities and stocks of missiles and drones. They can mount attacks deep in the rear of Russian troops to the Volga, and further, Ukraine is striking industrial infrastructure and energy facilities on an ever greater scale month by month. A third of the territory of the annexed regions that Russia makes claim to has not been liberated from Ukrainian control. Ukraine firmly holds the capital and the right bank of the Kherson region, as well as significant parts of the Zaporizhia region. He concludes that there is no chance that all the constitutional territories of the Russian Federation can be liberated by military means in the near future. Russia failed and did not achieve its goals, writes Strelkov. Of course, the territories he claims are not sovereign territories of Russia at all, and it has no rights over them in international law. But in other respects, he is correct. Putin is an incredible loser, a profligate despot who has executed an absurd strategy at incredible cost. So, what is Strelkov's solution? Do we and the enemy have reserves? Strelkov asks. In the first case, the answer is ambiguous. Theoretically, yes, there are, and very significant ones. Our country is still not technically at war. Only the army is fighting. The mobilization of the armed forces and industry, the rear, the entire economy, and so on, was not carried out except for individual, non-comprehensive one-time measures. As a result, we still have significant mobilization potential, which theoretically could be used. This statement of Strelkov's sounds overly optimistic, perhaps, but he does continue. In practice, we have completely the opposite. It is a depressing picture. We do not receive timely and sufficient means to maintain a decisive victory. The Russian army is being bled dry. It is still enough to hold the front and even advance at a snail's pace in some places. With difficulty, they advanced forward, achieving purely tactical but very costly successes. But the prospects of achieving a strategic victory, defeating the opposing enemy forces, and forcing Ukraine to sign peace on our terms are more than doubtful, he says. Simply put, our troops can drag things out for quite a long time, but they cannot win, at least in their current form. Will general mobilization help us now? He asks. I find it difficult to answer this question unequivocally. The country, its armies, and the population are already very tired of the 3-year, bloody, and not very successful, to put it mildly, military campaign. Industry is acutely aware of the shortage of technical resources, and the reserves of military equipment likely are close to extinction. I do not have the information, but I have doubts whether the Ministry of Defence can arm, clothe, shoe, train, organise, feed, form into units and formations, and then introduce into battle at least 500,000 more fighters. For a strategic victory over Ukraine alone, no less than this is needed, possibly 1.5 to 2 times more than that. Moreover, this 500,000 needs to be delivered to the front, not as they bring water in single glasses and single doses, but all at once. In addition to technical issues, a second question arises. How will the country, the people, react to general mobilization now after 3 years of bloody tedium? Will we receive, instead of the long-awaited large reserves to the front, fuel for a revolt of the mobilized, like what happened in Petrograd in February 1917? He asks. Prerequisites for this exist. I am more than sure of this, and am ready to initiate such a revolt of force in the so-called elite. Well, as is well known, a bad peace is better than a good war, but will Moscow live to see this very bad peace? Personally, I doubt it, he says. Strelkov's assessment of Ukraine's strengths is at variance to what we often hear in the mainstream Western media and even propagandistic channels. While waging a total war, the Ukrainian armed forces have reserves, he says. According to various sources, they have from 150 to 300,000 newly mobilized servicemen undergoing combat training in EU countries. Let's subtract, say, 100,000 deserters, draft dodgers, and the like for good measure. Even so, Ukraine may end up with another 200,000 soldiers at the front by the spring of 2025. Let's assume that half of them will go to replenish the broken and battered units and formations. But they are receiving equipment from the US and Europe. And if they can defend Ukraine's lines, it will likely not agree to any truce at all. Why would it agree to a bad peace? Even if suddenly the supply of weapons and equipment from the US, Canada, Britain, France, Germany are turned off eventually, at least in 2025, adequate supplies will continue to be provided with a probability of 99%. That is, in the next 4 to 6 months, there will be no truce for sure, concludes Girkin. Turning to Russia's various overseas adventures and interventions, his prognosis is negative. Romania's participation in the liquidation of Transnistria is very likely, he says. It is one thing to talk about the inevitability of a volcanic eruption, and quite another to be caught in it. Unfortunately, he writes, also China has shown its readiness to comply with US sanctions against our fleet by blocking 5 tankers with Russian oil in Chinese territorial waters. The fact that China is far from supporting the current special military operation has been clear to me for a long time, he claims. It has also long been clear that China's patience in connection with the aforementioned inconveniences of the SVO is either running out or has expired completely. Russian victory and the end of the military conflict on terms that suit Moscow are not even on the horizon. Beijing is showing its irritation and transparently hinting to Moscow that it is time to end the war under any circumstances. And how to get out of this wonderful situation, having only North Korea as an ally, it is unclear to me, Strelkov writes, especially considering that society is not mobilized at all and is already very tired of the war and does not feel any enthusiasm for its further continuation. Of course, with certain propaganda efforts, the majority will swallow any retreat under the slogan so that there should be no more war, but two problems remain. The first is how the army will react to this. The second is more important. Who will guarantee that, having occupied the south of these regions that we claim as our own, that Kiev and its partners will not immediately spit on these very guarantees? Girkin is here assuming that any peace may be just as much a contingency arrangement for the Western allies as it obviously would be for the Russians. There is no trust here, so how can there be a deal? How can there be any peace? The situation at the front and beyond does not provide Strelkov Girkin any reason for optimism, either about his own life, the life of an imperial Russia that he longs for, and the Russian army as well. From his point of view, what is happening now cannot be called a victory for Russia. And that is a kind of realism that hopefully more Russians will start to embrace in 2025, that Russia is now in a no win scenario.